When is the right time for you to buy a commercial property? I'm Sam Powell.
And I'm Jared Krause, and we are the hosts of the Property Pals Australia podcast. And in this episode, we're chatting to Steve Palise, who is the author of Commercial Property Investing Explained Simply, also the podcast host, and he's helped so many people to buy commercial properties. And in this episode, we talk about how to go from being in the residential space and owning residential property to buying commercial property and what type of commercial property you should buy for your first deal.
Yeah, we also jump into chat with Steve about his most common risks within commercial property, and it's really important for people to, they get focused on the income side of commercial, but they often forego the mindset around, well, what are the risks involved? So we definitely jump into that, which is exciting.
Yeah, we also discuss the most common myths that people have when they come to Steve and they want to buy a commercial property. Myths that are not conducive or that are going to help them actually scale their portfolio.
Yeah. There's another little tip and trick in this episode too is the beauty of lease stock loans and how you can actually acquire commercial property from the income it produces without a large deposit.
Yeah, and we also discuss the yields of a commercial property versus buying for growth in commercial property and what's better for real wealth creation. Now, obviously, before we get stuck in this podcast episode, to buy a commercial asset, you do need a good deposit typically, unless you use a lease stock loan. So make sure you go away and get our mini course on how to maximize your borrowing capacity. You can get that at propertypals.au/resources. But for now, let's dive in and chat to Steve Palise.
Welcome to Property Pals, the podcast where we share everything around how to build a property portfolio, from researching areas, financing, structuring, buying, selling, and reinvesting to live a life of financial independence. As a disclaimer, any information shared by myself, Jared, Sam, and the Property Pals team is strictly general and should not be taken as constituting professional advice. You should consider seeking independent legal, financial, and taxation advice from a qualified professional.
Steve, welcome to the podcast.
All right, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have you, mate.
This one.
Yeah, me and Sam have been kind of kicking about each other's kind of, I don't know, LinkedIn's and kind of side hustles and stuff for a while. So it's actually finally nice to actually see you in person.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, we had a few FaceTimes here and there, but mate, you're always on my Instagram feed and socials feed. You're an intelligent man around commercial property, so we wanted to get you on board and pick your brain.
No, I'll go happy to answer anything, guys.
Absolutely. Actually, also, Sam, I came over to Bali about a month ago, and Sam gave me a book. He had like one chapter left to finish it, and I was like, I need to take it. I want to get into this.
It's just like a novel. Just read the first page and the last page, and you'll get the gist of it.
No, there's some really good stuff in there. Hey, Sam, I've actually learned a lot. I thought I'd learned a lot from commercial, like listening to other people's pods and your pod and stuff like that. But I've actually learned a lot from going through this. So I really appreciate it, guys. Check it out as well. Yeah,
I try to write it like a textbook where it's just like, go to the chapter on leases, you'll get 20 pages on leases. And that's actually what my book publisher said. She's like, you're the first person who's actually written a book word for word. Most business owners, they go get a ghostwriter, they fluff it up a bit. Whereas me being naive, because I never wrote a book before, I actually thought authors had to write their own books.
ChatGPT does it now, Steve.
Oh, dang it. So the second book was a bit easier though, because I did a resi book. So it's like half as complicated as commercial. So I just stripped out all the commercial stuff and then it's built on the fundamentals that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a great segue into that first question, I reckon.
Yeah, and that's why I've been getting into and learning more about commercial myself, is like, how do I make the step, or how do we, everybody listening, make the step from residential property to commercial property, and when's the right time for, I would say, maximum growth of a property portfolio? Is it like 2 to 3 resi properties? What size would they be? Because you do resi side. You started in the resi, moved into commercial. Yeah, I'd love to just like pick your brain around like somebody as a beginner, like moving into resi, and when's the best step to do it?
Yeah, I get asked this question pretty much every day. It's as everyone says, it's always like case by case, but it normally comes down to what you're trying to achieve over what time frame versus what you've got to work with. And what I mean by what you've got to work with is finance. So how much finance you got So I normally answer this question is when when commercial's not right for you. So like you wouldn't go into commercial if you're starting out in your portfolio and you've still got like, if you want to be an aggressive investor and you've got 90% loans that you can get with the banks, I would much rather go out and buy 3 residential properties on 90% loans than 1 commercial on a 70% because you have to have a lower LVR. Because if I get the same capital growth, you make 3 times as much. But then coming back to like what you're trying to achieve, if I've got a client who's 60 years old and they want to retire in 5 years' time, even though they might have a slightly bigger borrowing capacity for residential, that's not going to help their retirement. Like buying a negatively geared house in Adelaide, for instance, does not help their retirement. So they have to buy cash flow. So it doesn't have to be commercial. It could be a block of apartments, regional towns, house and granny flats, all that type of stuff. But that's their focus about what they're trying to achieve in the what time frame. I get a lot of like people that say, oh, I want a 50K passive income in 5 years. Cool. Again, even if you've got a slightly bigger borrowing capacity for resi, you're not going to get a 50 grand passive income unless you do something outside the box with residential. So then commercials, the move forward. So generally your borrowing capacity, you mentioned, Jared, once you've got a few residentials, that's when most people will dive into commercial, mainly because they have to, because interest rates are really high at the moment. They don't have the serviceability to be able to keep buying residential because basically what the banks do, and I'm rambling a little bit here, is they'll check your servicing. So they'll slap on 1.5 to 3% extra interest rates on what you're paying, do 80% of the rent you receive, and principal and interest. So if you buy slightly negative, like residential property, that's really negative in their eyes. And that's why they say no after 2 or 3 properties. Commercial's positive. So they do that criteria. It goes to say neutral. So you can push the envelope a little bit further. But then there's also a thing called lease stock loans in commercial. So if you're out of serviceability with residential, you can go get a loan based on the strength of the property you're buying, the length of the lease. And that's probably the game changers, whereas aggressive investors want to keep pushing, they can keep going. So like me personally, I buy into lease stock loans. So I've got the capital, don't have the servicing because of my portfolio, but it means I can keep going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends. It sounds like it depends on what your borrowing capacity is, like how much you can input into your portfolio of cash from your own personal income or business income, and how fast you can move into getting a deposit for your first sort of commercial. And what sort of size would you recommend somebody starting out at? Like say they do have like 2 or 3 resis. What sort of size commercial asset would you say is good for a beginner? And then what type as well?
Normally people starting out, I generally encourage industrial, just because it's a bit easy to get your head around the numbers, because you can look at like all the ones in the complex, what they sold for per square meter, what they rent for per square meter, how long they went vacant for. There's like a lot of like for likes, where something like a retail, you buy like, I don't know, a hairdresser and a little strip of 10 shops. If there hasn't been a vacancy there for a few years, you're completely guessing what the vacancy rate is. So I'd probably say industrial because it's a bit more kind of knowledge around what you're actually buying. Anywhere from about 500K, you start getting some good quality assets. We bought a couple of weeks ago, 180 grand warehouse in Brisbane. So you can go that low level. The negative with those are don't expect to get like a 5-year lease. It's going to be a average Joe's electrical services and they're going to sign 12, 24-month lease. Small businesses go one or two ways. They grow and they move on, or they close up shop. So you go through tenants a bit more often with those. But 500K, you get a good like 3 to 5 person business and you should get kind of like 2-3 year leases out of them and hopefully have them for 5 to 10 years at a time.
What yield are you running on those ones? Those lower price?
The size doesn't normally change the yield that much. So it depends where you buy. On average, I'm buying around a 6% net yield in kind of Sydney, Brisbane and Perth is kind of the area. 5.5 probably Adelaide and Canberra. You can go regional and get 7% net yields, but vacancy rates are high. So it's balancing that risk. What kills the yield a little bit on the smaller ones is property management fees, because they take like a leasing fee, similar to residential where they take like a couple of weeks rent as initial payment. They'll take like 7 to 15% every new lease that's signed. So if you're getting a new tenant every 3 or 4 years, taking 15% of that off erodes the yield quite a lot. So even though it might be a 6 and you're cycling through the tenants, it might end up being like a 5.2, 5.3. So that's probably the negative of the small ones. However, you can make an argument going out and buying 3 small ones, different locations, different tenants, different asset classes is a lower risk strategy as well.
Yeah, diversification is good. I definitely had one question around the yields. Like they've obviously compressed a lot from around that 8 to 9. It's going down to say 6 at the moment, as you mentioned. Is that like what's your feel around? Like, do you feel they'll retrace back to that sort of level, or this is the new normal moving forward?
I actually think it's a new norm. And the main driver for that is there are so many more investors in the commercial space now. Like 5 years ago, if I mentioned the word commercial, guys like you would just look at me blankly being like, nah, not going to touch it. Too high risk. Now, like I've sold 12,000 books in stores and given away about 15,000 of them as well. Like there's podcasts, there's other kind of buyers agents have books. Like there's so much more knowledge. So there's more investors coming around it.
Yeah.
If you ask for a forecast, I always tell clients when they ask me, oh, what's going to happen in the next 5 years? I say, it doesn't matter. You're owning this for life. So let's focus on the next 10 years. But there's a few scenarios that could play out. Like at the moment, inflation's pretty much 7.2, 7.4%. And we're seeing that translate to rental increase. So like on average, most industrial assets grew between 5 and 20% last year. That's going to keep going. I don't know how long. It might be a year or two and then the steam will come off. But that will creep the 6%. As long as interest rates stay the same, that increase in rent will bring up, say, 6% up to 6.57. So we'll see that kind of go there. There's two scenarios I see playing out. The ideal one is rents keep going up, interest rates come down, market explodes. I don't think that's going to happen. Like that's perfect for me because I've got commercials. I want it to grow. What I actually envisage is probably the interest rates stay about the same. The rents keep going up a little bit. We get up to that kind of 6.5%. And then the interest rate is going to be what dictates moving forward. Obviously, there's all the stuff I'm not an expert at. I'm not an economist. I can't predict when the recessions are coming and all that, but I just buy the fundamentals. Is that property going to be in more demand in 10 years' time than it is now? And you can do that without looking at interest rates and the industries and all that type of stuff. You can just literally do it through population growth if you want.
Yeah, that's a good sort of point around, like, we had one of the senior commercial valuers from Heron Todd White on, and he was just mentioning on the Gold Coast that there's a massive undersupply in industrial at the moment. And, you know, obviously with the lockdowns through COVID and the ripple effect that we're seeing where, you know, getting these building materials and also the trade shortages, it's hard to see, you know, supply, you know, outweighing that demand level for at least a number of years. Do you sort of track that as well with like construction rates and everything?
Well, I do because like I'm looking at it all day, every day. And you can also look at like vacancy rates and like there's like CBRE, Savills, Knight Frank, they all do reports. It's generally for 10,000 square meters plus, but it'll give you a good indication. But just going on that, like Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast, most of the areas we're buying is 0% vacancy rates. Zero. So when people say, oh, commercial's high risk, it's not. The benefit / negative is because build costs have gone up so much, developers aren't really developing as much anymore. But part of our due diligence process is to talk with town planners and find out what's coming up. Not so much from the like oversupply part of it. I just want to get an understanding of vacancy rates and kind of what's coming up. But if you buy like an industrial complex and it's surrounded by residential and that residential population is growing and you talk to the town planners and they're building new Westfields and more like medium and high density apartments and stuff like that, how is there going to be less demand for a warehouse? You still need car mechanics, wholesalers, distributors, fabricators, storage, all that type of stuff. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat it for your listeners. Like there's still risks, but you can mitigate those risks with assessing stuff like that. The ones where you're looking at new stuff getting built is when you're buying greenfield sites. So if you're buying on like, I don't know, say Gold Coast, like out in Nerang and those kind of further west areas there where they are building new warehouse complexes, that's going to affect your vacancy rates. But I always just buy like tightly held, low risk stuff.
Yeah, that's smart. I think it's a big shift that people are starting to understand through education that you can de-risk it a lot. And obviously that's a big part of what we're trying to do here is to get people's head around, you know, get educated in this space, right? And, you know, Jared's going through the journey himself, tossing up, you know, do we keep growing out residential or we're looking for these high yielding commercial plays?
Yeah. Like I said, it's going to come down to like what you're trying to achieve and what your borrowing capacity is. Like I had a client a month ago who had $0 borrowing capacity for residential and $2 million for commercial because he had the capital, but he had no servicing for residential. So we got him a lease doc loan. So even though theoretically he might have wanted a residential, commercial is the answer. He has to buy commercial. So that's where you balance. But it just depends where you're at. If you're doing developments or still trying to grow the resi, if you enjoy your job, that surprisingly has a big part as well because people go, oh, I can only graft this job out for another 5-10 years and I'm done. Cool. Then we have to start building cash flow anyway. And you don't care. Like you go through waves as well. Like without sounding arrogant, like I've got a big portfolio. I don't care about my net wealth anymore. And because no one's impressed whether you say you got a $3 million portfolio or a 5 or a 7 million, it doesn't change your day-to-day life. But I sold a few of my residential properties and transferred them into commercial because increasing 100K passive income to a 200K passive income, I actually feel way wealthier, even though my future net wealth is going to be less because I've got a smaller portfolio because of it. But I don't care. It lets me spend time with my daughter. I did 16 countries in the last 2 years. Like, it gives you some form of lifestyle back as well. But that's just me. Like, if you're a mum and dad client, some people want to pass a property on to their kids or whatever it may be. But I want to live life. Like, that's the whole reason I built a portfolio, was to have some fun.
Yeah, I'd love that. I love that example. And I'd love you to explain to everybody why you will have a smaller net wealth, but you're getting more passive in the shorter term. How does that, just so people understand, like, because the way I think about it as well is, all right, buy a bunch of resis, high growth locations, get the capital growth, obviously not making any, much rental yield. They might be negatively geared rental yield, but I'll get good capital growth, sell it when the property market cycle sort of turns, hold a bit of cash, and then get into commercial. That's what I'm thinking with my property portfolio. And it sounds like you've done a similar thing, maybe at different timelines in the property cycle, but you've sold off some resis, got into commercial, and you are earning a better passive income, but you're going to have less sort of net wealth or a smaller portfolio. Can you explain how and why that works?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, because I buy lease stock loans, so I get the loan based on generally because interest rates are high now. But the whole premise of a lease stock loan is if the rent covers the mortgage, they'll give you the loan based on the lease. So you get a 5-year loan. But because interest rates are high now, so say interest rates are 7.5% and I get a 6% yielding asset, I have to have like a 65, 70% LVR to kind of be in the green. So they'll actually give it to me. So even though I had like 80% LVR on some properties, when I sold them, now that's transferred to 70 and 65%. So I've actually got less on paper net wealth because my portfolio size actually gone down, but my cash flow's gone up. But that's what I mentioned. Like, I don't care anymore. And I know I sound very arrogant saying this, but I wasn't getting happier. Every time I bought another property, I wasn't going like, oh yeah, now I've got number 12. Like, doesn't change it. Weirdly, it's exponential. Like, you get more excited when you make your like first 50 grand passive income, then it has to be 100 grand, then it's got to go to 200 grand, like everything kind of exponential that way. But yes, basically because I need a smaller LVR, but I try not to talk about my circumstances too much on this, not because I want to hide it, but I'm not applicable to 99% of everyday investors. Like 7 years ago, I was an engineer. Then I left to join a small buyer's agency and my salary went from 150 to 50 grand. So borrowing capacity completely shrunk then. Then I finally started building more resis. Then I went through a divorce. So I had to pay out my partners the portfolio there. Then 2.5, 3 years ago, I started my own business. So my borrowing capacity disappeared again because new business, no tax returns. So I had to go lease stock loans. So all these convoluted parts of my plan is not applicable to a mum and dad client who have a steady job and things like that. I've had to work around a few kind of things because I am constantly doing something different.
Yeah, well, that makes complete sense to me. And everyone is different, but like my mind always goes to like end of the day where everyone's chasing that cash flow because it can give them options on what they can do. And obviously in the, I guess, planning stage of people's life cycle, right? Like gets to the latter stages, they need to retire on income. And that's sort of like the whole premise that I'm trying to help people understand is there are ways to go about this, and commercial property is a fantastic way because you can use leverage. And once you start working with people, because there are risks involved in obviously my opinion, and that's why we're massive advocates of buyer's agents, because for good quality buyer's agents like yourself, because you're de-risking it every single way, you're educating people on the way in, and then once they get that first one under their belt, obviously that confidence builds. And going lease stock loans is a really, like, a lot of people don't really understand how that even is possible, right? Until they start listening to things like this and going, oh wow, I didn't even know that exists, because I was that person a number of years ago.
Yeah. The thing with the resi is you can get by not knowing that much. And I know buyer's agents are like, oh no, we've got the secret sauce and that. But as long as you don't do something stupid, like don't go out and buy in a mining town or in a flood zone or something like that. If you just buy a 3-4 bedroom brick house and check the fundamentals, like good vacancy rates, like good infrastructure spending, good population growth, you'll be okay long term because you're always going to have a tenant. But commercial, because there's way more moving parts, you can burn yourself if you don't know what you're doing. So that's why I don't want to sugarcoat it and be like, oh, this is the best thing ever. Because if you buy something and say it's a bad one and it sits there vacant for a year and it's $1 million property on a 7% like interest rate, like 70% LVR, that's really going to like kill you. Like that's going to be what, 50 grand a year, just interest repayments. So your buffers have to be more, But just in terms of checking stuff, like you got to do lease review, contract review, tenant interviews, foot and road traffic analysis, credit history check on the tenant, speak with town planner, vacancy studies, occupancy studies, check guarantors on the lease. Like there's so much to it. Like my checklist is like 70 pages long. So it's not for the faint hearted. You either go all in yourself or you get a buyer's agent who's reputable and can kind of do it for you. But the benefit is you get generally 2 to 3 times more rent. So if you're trying to build a passive income with resi, you can do it in half the time with commercial. Obviously more risk, but you can actually get in half time. And a commercial, instead of paying itself off in 30 years like residential, you can do it in sub 15 years quite easily.
Yeah, I'll just walk me through that, because obviously people have that understanding, I'll buy it in 30 years' time, the loan will be paid off. But with commercial, because you get that higher income, right, that helps you contribute to pay it down within, 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, it used to be less than 10 years. Now interest rates are higher. It's about 12 years on average. So that's just normal numbers of like 70% loan, 6% net yield, 6.5% interest rate. It'll kind of, because you've got the cash as well. So it's because it's like 15, 20 grand a year positive. If you throw additional savings, and I'm just talking interest only, where you put the cash back into it, it's about 12 years at the moment. If you want to chuck an extra 10, 15 grand into it per year, it obviously shrinks that. But for resi, no chance. Like you're banking on the rents tripling in 30 years and you paying off the mortgage in 30 years as well. And then again, it's half the rent. So where you might buy like $1 million commercial on a 6% net yield, and in 10 years time, the rent's double and you have it paid off, it's 120 grand passive income. Like to get that with a residential, you need what, 3.5, 4 mil portfolio just to get the same enough rent coming in. And that's excluding like council rates, water rates, all that type of stuff. So commercial does offer that option. But like I said, there's risks involved and you really have to know you do your homework.
Yeah, I see the biggest risk around tenants defaulting or vacating. Would that be probably one of the biggest, do you think, or what would be the top 3?
No, not if you know what you're doing. So like funny you say that. The people always worry about that. When I send them a property, they always worry about who the tenant is, whereas my mindset is worrying about who the future tenants are, because the best tenant in the world is not going to be there in 20 years' time. The best tenant right now is a growing business who's going to leave in 5, 10 years' time. So I really focus on the fundamentals of the area and what tenants can move in. But to mitigate that risk, you basically get guarantees on the loan. So like similar how residential they pay a bond, you also get that in commercial. It can be generally about 3 months. But then you can also have a personal or bank guarantee for the lease as well. So you can at least plan out and protect yourself for the length of the lease. The unknown, which I think you're alluding to, is the risk of vacancy, is trying to understand that and how long that's going to be. At the moment, it's great because every capital city, we're sub 0.5%. 5 years ago, we're like 7%. So it was a really big risk because we're talking 6, 12-month vacancies, but you plan your buffers with that. However, the comparison I always use with resi is you have to plan a good buffer for residential for maintenance, because if hot water system goes, air conditioner goes, roof collapses, blah, 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 that's 10, 15, 20 grand. Whereas like an industrial property, it's 3 concrete tilt-up panels and a roller door. Like not much can go wrong. If you buy a body corporate one, as long as it's got a healthy admin and sinking fund, that protects you there as well. So it's lower risk in regards to that. But yeah, you need to set your buffers in place. And even if like you're going to buy multiple commercials, one of my techniques is never get leases ending at the same time. So if we're going to buy 3 commercials, get one ending in 2025, one in 2026, one in 2027. So we're never going to have 2 or 3 go vacant at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
With the multiple commercials, say like you mentioned as a beginner, like starting out with industrial, it makes sense. You get your tilt panels and it's, a lot less going on and a lot less to learn, I guess. Where would typically people progress from maybe one industrial commercial property or 2, and then what will they go into a different, like more specific commercial property after that? And is there a most common one, and why?
A lot of people just buy a few industrial. The next progression and what I also buy is retail. So not Westfields, like no one can afford that really. We're talking suburban retail, medical centers, hairdressers, nail salons, dentists, the little strip shops where they're really good because you have the tenant for the life of the business. Whereas, as I mentioned before, with industrial, if the business does well, they don't open another warehouse. They upsize, and because it's very easy going with a few forklifts and trucks and you can move within a day. Whereas you buy like a hairdresser, if they do really well, they don't upsize to a bigger hairdresser. They open another hairdressing salon. So you actually get a longer period of tenure for retail However, the vacancy is not 1 month like it is with industrial. Like that, you're probably looking at in a good area, 6 to 12 months, is probably an average. So you need a bigger buffer. But then you're probably going to have the tenant for 10, 15 years if it's a good business. So that one, analyzing the business, and what you mentioned, Sam, before about, what if they leave? That's way more critical when you're assessing the actual tenant, because they're the value at the moment for the longevity of it.
Before we continue today's pod, I want to ask you a few questions. What is your property investment goal? What type of properties do you want to own? How many? What size valuation property portfolio do you want to own? And how much net income do you want to be earning? Essentially, what's your magic number in passive income that you want to be earning? And do you know how to get there? And if you do you know how to get there in the least time possible with the least amount of risk? Sam and I have been helping people invest in property and build property portfolios for years. People who are now replacing their income through property, and we want to help you do the same. Right now, for a limited time, we are offering free property coaching to our listeners. We won't be able to do this forever, of course, so head to propertypals.au/coaching. That's propertypals.au/coaching to see how we can help you achieve your investment property goals. Link will be in the description too.
I've got a question that always runs my mind, because I look at cycles, right? Like, it's interesting to see industrials, a massive flavour at the moment, and office has been just shot in the arse after COVID. What's your opinion around that? Do you see them running at different cycles, or is it sort of just, and even on a state by state basis, or like,
yeah? So it's the same as residential. All the capital cities work at different times. Commercial operates in a different cycle to the residential market, even in areas as well, because they're kind of like one after the other. You've got to be careful when you say like commercial property, because people want me to say like, here's a blanket statement for commercial. But commercial is everything. Like you said, it's retail, industrial, office space. They're all completely different asset class. We shouldn't put them in the same category, because it's not. But in saying that, though, like, I've never bought office space. Like, for me, office space is like buying a high density off the plan apartment. Like, you're paying a lot of money for a bit of concrete in the sky, where next door they can build a 20-story skyscraper because they've got zoning for it, and completely price you out of the market and have vacancies shoot through the roof. So that's why I like suburban retail industrial, because it's got that land component, which is the scarcity factor. So I'm not saying I don't buy office. I have bought some office, but it has to have an X factor, like medical. Like, if I can get like a medical suite next to a hospital where I go, okay, this is always going to have a specialist, always going to have the ear, nose and throat surgeon, blah, 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 renting it out. But again, you're not playing, there's no value add there. The value add is the tenant in that, and that's it. You're not doing anything else.
With your medical side, the yields, like from my background valuation, they always seem to be more attractive, so the yields would be tighter. Is that still the case that you're finding?
Definitely. There's certain things people love. Like, the one that baffles me is childcare centers. I see people go out and spend like 3.5% yield on a childcare center. I'm just like, this is baffling. If you lose a childcare center, like, that's a very one-dimensional asset. Like, you're not going to be able to fill it quite quickly. Yeah. So that's a big gamble. Whereas that's why I like the kind of more versatile ones with the foot traffic and the road traffic or industrial. But yeah, you normally knock off about 0.5 to 1% for kind of blue chip assets. Same as if you buy like a McDonald's or a Bunnings, and that they're going to obviously be a lower, because I want to use this word, they're perceived lower risk. Whereas I always say that because, like, you go buy a Bunnings for 3% and someone says, it's low risk. If I get you a 6% yielding random industrial in Brisbane, that Bunnings has to double in value or double in cash flow just to be on par with me. My property could sit there vacant 50% of the time, and I still get the same return as the Bunnings. So it's just a perception of risk more than anything. Same as residential. People perceive Sydney and Melbourne as low risk, but if you go back 30 years ago and compare average house price now to then, they're actually not the front runners.
Yeah, going back to that, like, do you feel that the Sydney Melbourne market leads that? Like from looking back in the day, the Sydney used to be a bit tighter in yield because people would perceive that to be a lower risk location because of the bigger CBDs. Is that still the case where do you sort of see those ripple effects coming out where the confidence comes in the commercial market in Sydney, and then there's a lagging factor into, say, Brisbane?
Yeah, it's, again, property prices are emotional. It's what we value it kind of be. Sydney's actually coming pretty good. Like, Melbourne's yields are still really low, but commercial, I'm buying quite a lot in the Northern Beaches at the moment at 6% net yields for industrial and retail. But again, it's just where you choose your data point. People from Sydney and Melbourne think they're the starting point. but it's not. You've just chose that's because that's where you're basing it. You go back 30 years ago and look at average house price in every capital city to average house price now, Hobart actually wins, which is a small country town, because it's like you could buy a house for $80,000 that's now 500, 550 quite easily, whereas you still have to spend 180 to 250 on a house in Sydney that's now 1.2. So percentage wise, again, it's just perception. I'd also argue buying a very small 80 square meter warehouse in Sydney is higher risk than buying a freestanding warehouse in Brisbane for the same price, because you've got more value add opportunities and things like that. But again, I hate making blanket statements with commercial because it completely depends on what you're buying, like, and what's surrounding it. Different like asset classes, even like, let's say industrial. If you buy near an airport or a port, they're going to be distribution-based businesses because they're the ones that send stock out around Australia, around the world. If you buy the one I mentioned before that's surrounded by residential, they're service-based businesses. They're the car mechanics, spray painters, kitchen fabricators, all that type of stuff, because they're servicing the area around there. If they're on the outskirts, they probably need a bigger floor space because they're going to be the road transport ones, the ones where the truck pick up all the major manufacturing plants and stuff like that, because they're a bit more of a dirty industrial. So me purely saying like, oh, industrial's good in Brisbane, there's 5-6 different types we're talking.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess like you deal with a lot of clients every day, and there's always always interests me to sort of get your opinion on this. Is what would you feel like people come to you and they ask these questions? They have these perceived ideas of what they want to buy in a commercial because they might have read a book or listened to 1 or 2 podcasts. Mm-hmm. And what would you say would be the most common inaccurate, I guess, beliefs for the Australian buyer from the commercial space?
Oh, good question. You mentioned medical before. People always perceive medical to be low risk. But as I mentioned before, most medical, unless it's like a suburban dentist where it's like a retail shop, is some form of office space. So you're paying an absolute premium to have an office space which doesn't have the same capital growth, and you're putting all your money into that medical staying there. So like people will say, oh, it's the lowest risk. It's actually not. If you lose that tenant, you are stuffed. You're like, your $1 million property, once you lose that tenant, will drop to 750, 800 instantly just because of the tenant, because you're paying that premium for the tenant. So that's probably the biggest myth. But normally people come to me and they just say, oh, look, I don't want to buy like a high vacancy rate one. Like they're scared of that. And that's because some of the other buyers agents, they're yield chasers. And you get this in residential as well, where they go out and they buy the really regional areas and they're like, oh, it's great, we're getting a 7.2% net return. I'd argue buying a 6% net return in a really tightly held area with low vacancy rates, you'll get better rental increases, lower periods of vacancy, and better capital growth. So your ROI will look much better. It just doesn't look as flashy from the get-go. But I'd much rather that and be able to sleep at night than have a property sit there vacant for 2 years where your return goes to zero. It's actually negative because then you have to pay for council rates and water rates and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Do you run through those numbers with people that come to you and they go, I want to get, a higher yield, not so much like a low vacancy rate, and then you sort of educate them a little bit of like, hey, here's the numbers of like if we get something in a highly held area and the growth rate is quite good, and that growth rate is going to help us to achieve a better yield for our next tenant, or increase our yield with the current tenant. Do you sort of go through a bit of an education process with them to help them sort of see like they could buy a better asset, but by just understanding a little bit more? And what are some of the things that you share with them to help them?
I'm fully transparent. The good thing for me is because like a lot of my clients come through reading my book and watching the podcasts and all of my YouTube videos and stuff like that. They're somewhat educated, but it's just assessing what they're trying to achieve. Like, I don't normally buy in Townsville because vacancy rates for industrial and retail are really high. However, a few months ago, we bought for a client there, we bought a whole shopping centre for 3.4 mil that had 12 tenants. And this client was about 63, 64, I think, from memory. He does not care about capital growth. He wants something low risk with as big a return as possible. So if he was a 25-year-old, I probably wouldn't have bought it for him because I would have been like, look, there's better capital growth prospects elsewhere. But a lot would have to go wrong for him to kind of lose some money on this one in terms of cash flow, because he was actually paying cash. He actually sold a Sydney property, bought it for cash. If he loses 1 or 2 of the tenants, he's still getting a really good cash flow. So his goal was cash flow. Yeah. So we mitigate the risk by buying lots of tenants. So there's that. But yeah, you're always just trying to understand what they're trying to achieve versus what their risk profile is. And you're right. Normally I'm educating people, especially the higher risk like clients, like the ones with kids and stuff like that, and a big PPOR mortgage and stuff like that. That's where you're like, look, we're not going to chase yield, because the extra yield doesn't normally change your life. Like if you go buy $1 million one and you lose 1%, like it's a difference between having like a 25 grand passive income or like a 15 grand passive income. And I know 10 grand sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's changing your quality of holiday a little bit once a year. That's it. But if that property is growing more than 10 grand a year, you're going to be much better off in 5 years' time, because you're going to have leverage to pull out equity or have extra value there. Hopefully the rents grow more as well, so that makes up the difference in the next 5 years. So yeah, exactly right. You just got to educate them. But that's my whole thing, and why people come to me is because I seem like the education guy.
Basically comes into human psychology, I believe, is same in business. When I teach people to buy businesses and when we're talking property or when we want to achieve anything in our life, I think a lot of humans now more than ever are wanting to get that instant gratification and that cash grab a lot faster versus, hey, let's go for maybe capital growth, and we're gonna get a far better result in the long run. And that's what Sam and I are big, fans of, and is like, hey, play the long game, play long-term games, long-term people, and you're gonna win, versus trying to get that quick cash grab, which actually can slow down the growth of your portfolio, right?
Yeah. I did that exact thing with my portfolio. So I used to be the resi cash flow guy, and I bought in like Cairns and Foster and all these regional towns. And I got a good passive income from it, because when interest rates were low, I was like 50 grand passive income. So I was like the guru. I'm like, oh, look how well I've done. But I bought some stupid properties. Like I bought an apartment in Cairns for $30,000 that rented for $180 a week. And because banks wouldn't lend to it, I had to pay cash. So by the time I paid the 30 grand, stamp duty, legals, all that stuff, it ended up being like 35 grand. That kind of 180 grand ended up being about $100 a week positive, because like council rates and all that type of stuff as well. I shouldn't have bought that. Like that was number 3 in my portfolio. Like that was dumb. Why the hell didn't I go to a bank and leverage? I could have bought a house in Western Sydney for 300 grand on a 90% LVR, and that would now be worth 1.2 million. Whereas I sold that one 3-4 years ago for 55 grand or whatever it was. Like that was a silly exercise. But again, my eyes lit up for that instant gratification. I'm like, $30,000 apartment, $180 a week rent. I have to buy it. I actually sold my car at the time. I had a nice like Subaru Liberty. I sold that. I looked at my car and looked at the property. I was just like, sorry, car, you're going, I'm buying this property. But again, this wrong property, wrong time. That one might have been better for like an exit strategy. If you're an older investor, you want to kind of get the cash flow later on, where you might sell some residential, reduce the LVR and buy it cash.
Yeah, I'm still looking at opportunity cost, every single purchase. And like, I'm like going back to what you said before too, around like the sleep at night factor. That's massive for me. Where I see investors or just property people going wrong is just they're going too hard, too fast, or over leveraging themselves. And then that one small mistake like can unravel really quickly. And then that stops them from investing in the future because they've been burnt that at one time. And then it's such a shame to see that, because I mean, you do need to get your money working for you, so you don't have to work for the money at the end of the day. And I guess people like yourself, it's just great that there's so much education out there now. But now I'm seeing actually there's a big there is an issue with there's so many people coming into this space, and it's like people are getting they're getting these micro lessons in things and then making these massive financial decisions, and they're getting that overconfident to a point where, because they're not doing it every single day, they just can't compete against people like yourself in this space. So that's why I wanted to get you on board and I guess pick your brain. So
you raised a good point. Like ego is the big one as well. I find like people like they buy so many little cheap properties and like, oh, I've got 5, and they think they're the best investor in the world. And then I'll get like a client to call me like, oh, look, so I've only got 2 properties. And then you find out it's 2 Bondi houses that are worth $3 million, and they're kind of deflated about it. I'm like, you are better than 90% of the people I talk to. But again, there's this weird thing with numbers of properties. But as you get wealthier, generally that shifts a little bit as well, because you realize people stop caring and you're just doing it to kind of tell other people. And then that feeling dissipates real quick.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Playing a social status game versus playing a game of like comfort, sleep at night factor, and actually fulfillment versus, fake fulfillment, which is a social status game. Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. Thanks so much for coming on. Everybody is listening. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you check out this book, Commercial Property Investing Explained simply, I should say.
Yeah. Actually, go out and buy it, guys. Go out and buy it. Don't just pass it on to your friends.
Yeah, good point.
That's what Sam did for me. Don't do that.
In all seriousness, guys, if you go to my website, paliseproperty.com, just use free book at checkout. And I send the books out for free, so you can get a hard copy for free.
I've got one last question for you, Steve, before I love you and leave you.
All right, mate.
Why are you doing this, mate? Why are you helping all these people?
Yeah, I actually get asked this question a lot, and I actually give an honest answer, is because being a buyer's agent pays pretty damn well, and it means you have a different level of life. Like, if I can have a couple $100 grand with my passive income and earn a few $100 grand doing this as business, money is not really an object then. Every time I want to go on a flight, I can book business class without looking. Obviously, still want a good reputation, and that's why I do it, but it makes money like everyone else. Don't believe all those buyer's agents that say, oh, I'm doing this to give back. You wouldn't be charging 15 grand a pop, etc. if you're doing it to give back. Like, you're doing it to make money. But yeah, it just gives me a different level of life. So instead of looking at a 3 mil house to buy, I can look at a 5 or 6 mil house. So yeah, it's just best of both worlds. I love it, pays well, and it complements what I do anyway.
Yeah, and another little thing I just sort of throw in there as a comment is, there are more and more buyers agents coming out in this space, and it's important that you're dealing with those that have the runs on the board and are well experienced, because they just you learn just by doing in this industry. There's only so much you can read and watch before you get deep into it. And Steve's one of these ones that he's had the cuts and the bruises, and he's helping people change their lives. So jump on and read the book. Jump on his website.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So I still learn stuff every single week, and I'm 1,500 acquisitions down the rabbit hole. So how are you going when you've done 1 or 2 purchases? But as I always say, don't trust anyone with your wealth. Like, no one cares as much as you. Make sure whoever you're buying with, pester them, ask them questions. Like, I give an 80-page due diligence report. So you go through it, you ask questions. Like, don't trust anyone with your wealth. No one cares. Everyone's trying to make a little bit of money out of you here and there.
Yeah, I think you can outsource people to help you do certain things and help you invest. You should never, ever, ever outsource responsibility.
Yeah.
Your own responsibility.
Spot on, Jared.
Thanks for coming on, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome, guys. Thank you.
Good to have you, mate. So yeah, we'll have to get you back on just to annoy you, pick your brain more, the more questions that come through. But yeah, thanks very much for your time. Love your work.
We can do whatever you want. Breakdowns, cash flow. We can even use some examples and get some spreadsheets up, whatever you guys want to do.
Well, that's a good introduction. So jump on the comments, everyone, and put those questions forward. Obviously, wealth of knowledge, and we all want to work towards educating you more so you can make those better decisions with your finance. And enjoy the ride.
Awesome. Thanks, boys.